Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's master session entitled Poverty, Neglect, and Resilience, How They Intersect for American Families. I want to welcome those who are in the room and also those who are joining us online via live stream. As a reminder to those who are joining us via live stream, please use the interactive features, and we welcome your questions, comments, and hope that you'll engage with us here in the room. And for those in the room, we do have mics in the center aisle and hope that you'll participate in the discussion as well. It is truly an honor and a privilege to welcome our two speakers here to the stage. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Catherine Eden, who is with the Department of Sociology. And I will just say that Catherine is one of the nation's leading poverty researchers working in the domains of welfare and low-wage work, family, and neighborhoods, and has written a book that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with and that she will be talking more about and as part of that work. I also would like to welcome, really a friend and a mentor to me, Dr. Valerie Mahomes, who is a pediatric trauma and critical illness branch with the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Dr. Mahomes is chief of the newly formed Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Long title, but it is an excellent office, and I just want to go ahead and give the floor to them and really welcome all of you. Thank you.
So every research project has its origin story, and for me, it was the summer of 2010 when I left my home in Boston, Massachusetts, and came to Baltimore to follow up on a long-term study I had been doing with several colleagues on the transition to adulthood among young people who had been born in the mid-1990s into Baltimore public housing. So I was supposed to be doing this study on the transition to adulthood, but many of you might know that back in the 90s, just prior to welfare reform, I published a book with Laura Lane based on hundreds of interviews we'd done around the country. And in fact, I spent my 20s doing this research project with low-income single mothers, asking them about their budgets and exploring how they made ends meet. And I bring up that book because having done that for so many years in my 20s in so many cities, I have this sort of mental calculator. If Joan and I were to go out for dinner, I might be thinking in the back of my mind, I wonder how Joan makes ends meet. So anyway, I arrived at the home of Ashley, who lived in a public housing project in the shadow of that Dickensian Baltimore prison. And the first thing I noticed when I came into Ashley's home is that she looked physically unkempt, right? She was depressed. As we talked, she was holding her baby, her 2-week-old baby, she's 19, and you know, shifting her baby from shoulder to shoulder. And you know that maternal instinct to put the hand at the baby's neck to support the head, that wasn't happening with Ashley. And so as I looked around the house, I noticed that there was only a table with 3 legs, so it was kind of useless, pushed against the table, a single chair, a trash-pick couch, and a filthy twin mattress with a torn, fitted Bugs Bunny sheet on it. So as we sat, Ashley in the chair with her baby and me on the floor, I happened to have the perfect view of her kitchen cabinets. They had no doors, as is sometimes the case in public housing, and they were empty. And so this mental calculator that I had managed to suppress for several years came back on, and I began asking Ashley about her budget. And what I learned stunned me. There was no income, actually no food stamps at the time. Yes, the family had Medicaid. Yes, the family had a housing subsidy, but they were living virtually cashless lives. So as a prior student of welfare reform, I had an epiphany. I don't know that I thought it was an epiphany then, but I wondered in the back of my mind, in the aftermath of welfare reform, could it be that a new kind of poverty so deep that we hadn't even thought it was possible that it existed had arisen kind of right under our noses in America, a kind of cashless existence? And if so, what was that like? So I sort of tucked that insight into my back pocket. And the next day, I returned to Ashley's home. I'd given her $50 the day before in exchange for the interview, which is typical in our work. But I was worried about her and the baby. So I said, well, how about I stop by tomorrow to see how you're doing? And she agreed. Now imagine my surprise when I was greeted at the door by Ashley. She was making eye contact. She'd gone and gotten a home perm, frankly. She looked great. She'd walked down Broadway Avenue to the Goodwill in Fells Point there in Baltimore and bought a pantsuit. She was wearing that pantsuit, and she was just depositing the baby with her mother. And I kid you not, there was a smile on her face and a spring in her step as she announced she was on her way out, having forgotten I was coming, of course, on her way out to look for a job. So I began to wonder, you know, in the world's most advanced capitalist society, was there something distinctive about cash? After all, because of the extension of Medicaid and other in-kind benefits and the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States, I knew that we actually spent more, not less, on poverty than ever before. But I also knew that less and less of it was coming in the form of cash to the bottom fifth of the income distribution. So was there something special about cash, and was cash essential to well-being? Was cash the difference between the Ashley I had met day one, depressed, unable to properly care for her child, and day two, when she seemed to have a whole new outlook on life, all due to, yes, $50. I, too, was skeptical, by the way. In any case, I put that thought back into my back pocket and continued on in my study of the transition to adulthood. But that fall, Luke Schaefer, who is from the University of Michigan and, you know, a quantoid, came to be a visiting professor at Harvard, where I was teaching at the time. When he arrived at my office at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to say. I knew I was sponsoring him. I'd kind of forgotten he was coming. I was searching through my memory to think, okay, who is this guy and what do I know about him? You know, busy professors, beginning of the year. And it occurred to me that he was the nation's expert on the one data source that could tell us better than any other whether what I had observed with Ashley was just a blip, an N of 1, or a trend. And I think when he came back a week later with this chart, it stunned both of us. And so what you see there in the gold line is the growth in the percentage of U.S. households with children reporting cash incomes to the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which, by the way, captures more of the income of the poor and yields lower poverty rates than any survey we have, showed a growth in $2 a day poverty among American families with children from about 600,000 families to 1.5 million families with 3 million children. Now, all data sets are prone to error, and so we always want to look to multiple indicators. The next place we went to see if Ashley's story was a blip or a trend were administrative records from the SNAP program. Many of you know that if you lie to SNAP, it says right on the food stamp application that fraud is punishable by up to 20 years in prison. In fact, it's a more severe potential penalty than if an adult molested a child. Also, the food stamp program checks. They check the BLS, they check the welfare records, and so it's much harder to underreport your income, although, of course, some of that goes on. Nonetheless, there's no reason to believe that the SNAP program is getting more underreporting over time. And what we see here, actually, if we added 1995 to this chart, it would be even more dramatic. We've just done that. Is that there's been a quadrupling, yes, a quadrupling in the number of families in the United States reporting zero cash income when they apply to the SNAP program or when they recertify for SNAP. So from about 300,000 to 1.3 million. And again, you have actually a quintupling if you add in 1991, a 5-time growth in the percentage of zero-income SNAP households. Sometimes you'll hear people argue, economists argue about how to build a trend line. They'll say, oh, you have to, use this inflator or that inflator. The great thing about zero is it's zero. And nothing is always nothing, no matter what inflation adjuster you use. What you see there also is the food stamp numbers plotted against our own estimates from the SIP. An almost eerie correspondence between the two numbers, but you see sort of the food stamp numbers taking off above our estimates in the later period. And as I'll show in a minute, that's likely due to the increasing rate of homelessness. If you're homeless, you're not going to be in the SIP because the SIP, like most surveys, is a household-based sample. And we estimate that in our ethnographic sample, about half of our families probably would not have been captured by a household survey. So this is the number of homeless children in the United States as reported by their schools. We began collecting these data in 2004. That initial blip is Katrina. But after that, we see this monotonic rise in the number of school-aged children who are either homeless or do not have a regular place to live. This is data from Feeding America about demand in American food pantries. So these are survey data, surveys taken from food banks. And these are data from the census taken from American citizens themselves, both showing an unprecedented rate of growth in access to our food banks across America. So all indicators from a variety of data sources that something is going on at the bottom that is different than had been going on before. So what we did next is go back to the field because we needed to find out if we could go to places around the country where the SIP indicated we might find the $2 a day poor, whether we could find them easily, and then whether we could follow them over months and years so we could figure out how to think about the fact that so many more American families with children were living without cash in a land of such abundance, with also abundant cash resources, especially in those states that expanded Medicare. So we chose 4 places across the United States: Chicago, Cleveland, Appalachia, and the Mississippi Delta. We identified 18 families that we followed between 2012 and 2015. And what we identified in the book, $2 a Day, and I'm only going to give you a teaser of how people survive because I want you to buy the book and I want you to share it with your friends. But I will kind of give you a little glimpse into the story of causality, what causes $2 a day poverty. First, there has been the absolute striking collapse of our cash welfare system in the United States. In the late 1980s, about 8 in 10 poor families with children were touched by our cash welfare system. That number is down to about 2 in 10 today. That's a rough metric of access among the poor. Okay, so 5 million adults and their dependent children used to be served in 1994 by the cash welfare system. We are down now across all 50 states to just 850,000 adults and their minor children, half of them in just 2 states, California and New York, leaving about 450,000 adults across the whole USA. In the Deep South and the mountain states, that TANF to poverty ratio, the percent of poor families that are touched by the cash welfare system, is often in the single digits. But nowhere is welfare more dead than in the imaginations of the poor, including the $2 a day poor. When we asked Madonna Harris, who was living with her daughter Brianna across a string of homeless shelters in Chicago, why she didn't apply for cash welfare, she turned and looked at us like we were crazy. And she said, well, haven't you heard? They're just not giving that out anymore. Travis Compton, he was literally standing at his window, looking at his window as we were talking. His little girls, Blythe and Rachel, playing at our feet. His wife, Jessica, sitting on the couch next to us, waiting for the sheriff's bailiff to evict them after they got 3 months behind in their rent because both of them had their hours reduced to zero at their fast food job when the tourist industry slowed in their mountain town. And when I asked Travis why he hadn't applied for cash welfare, he looked at me blankly and said, "What's that?" Now, Ray McCormick, who's kind of the center character in the book, did finally agree to apply for TANF. She claimed, she came back and I said, what happened? She claimed her caseworker told her, honey, I'm sorry, there are just so many needy people that we just don't have enough to go around. And according to our research, the state of Ohio was sitting at about $1 million TANF surplus during that time. We then had her keep a diary. She applied 3 more times to TANF, all without avail. And we have more and more evidence across the country of these soft diversions. And we can talk in Q&A about why so many welfare offices, so many states have chosen to shred their welfare rolls rather than to serve families in need. So don't forget to ask that question. But welfare isn't the whole story. If we had had the vigorous economy that we had in the late 1990s, I might not be here talking to you today. But as of 2000, the economy, especially for unskilled workers, began to decline. And in fact, the Great Recession was only an intensification. But the conditions and nature of low-wage work changed too. In our ethnography, we demonstrate a variety of unsafe work conditions, a fundamental problem of not being able to get full-time hours. But these part-time jobs requiring infinite availability, so you can't take on a second job. The rise of the 0-hour full-time contract, where you can be told at a moment's notice that you're not needed and then you're not paid. Wage theft is also common. So that's sort of the second leg of a 3-legged stool of causality. What's interesting is the degree to which work permeates the lives of the $2 a day poor. Here you see the rate of TANF usage among the just plain poor and the $2 a day poor. It's about 10% over the course of the year in both cases. This is following children in extreme poverty and $2 a day poverty over a year. But we see that over the course of a year, 70% of households containing a $2 a day poor child have an adult in the workforce. So very deep penetration of work, but these families are often hanging on to the edge of a low-wage labor market that has become frayed and perilous. Now, I wanted to talk especially about the third leg of that stool. That is the affordable housing crisis. Since 2000, rents have risen by about 6%. Those of you living in DC know that well. But renters' income has decreased by 12%, meaning an 18% gap has emerged so that rents and wages are now almost completely separate from one another. What we found among the $2 a day poor was that multiple perilous doubling up was ubiquitous. Now, it's hard to double up in America because if you're a renter, your landlord is going to be on your case if you let a sub-family move into the home because they're going to be worried about the water bill. And we can talk more about that. There's all kinds of reasons why landlords are really vigilant now about doubling up. And we saw several cases where the generous relative who took the family in ended up getting evicted in punishment for taking that family in. So families who double up, rather than being in stable situations, tend to move from house to house to house. As we were doing this research, we became very conversant with the ACEs literature, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And as we were following our families, we noted that experiences of neglect, abuse, and trauma were mostly occurring in the context of these multiple perilous double-ups. This was one story we tell in $2 a day of Jennifer Hernandez. She's living across a string of homeless shelters. Finally, an uncle opens his home. One day she returns home from running errands, and of course he's molesting 9-year-old Caitlin. I just never expected that, Jennifer said, and then described fleeing the home with her kids with as much things as they could carry stuffed into a pillowcase and running to a Goodwill that did not have family shelter services, but a kindly Goodwill worker emptying out an office to house the family until they can make their way back to Chicago. This had happened in Texas. Similarly, Ray McCormick, who had been living in and out of $2 to pay poverty since she was 12, when her father died and her mother abandoned her for a lover in the hills of Tennessee. Ray lives in Cleveland, says matter-of-factly to us, "I've been beat, I've been raped," describing these unstable living situations she has experienced as she has lived in a kind of a cashless poverty. Now, surviving $2 a day poverty is tough. We see a lot of ingenuity. We see a lot of struggle. We see the kind of survival strategies you really don't want parents of kids engaging in. For example, the sale of food stamps, while we know it's rare among the poor generally, is almost ubiquitous among the $2 a day poor. It turns out that you actually need a little bit of cash to survive in the world's most advanced capitalist society. You cannot use food stamps to buy diapers. You cannot use food stamps to purchase cough medicine. Food stamps won't buy your kids socks and underwear for school, nor will they pay the utilities. For example, Elva Mae Hicks sells about $600 of her food stamps every month to pay a $300 utility rate. The going rate there is about 50 cents on the dollar. And this virtually guarantees that her kids will go hungry because food stamps are only designed to get you through the third week of the month. But of course, that is a felony. Another ubiquitous survival strategy is selling plasma. Jessica Compton, the one who's about to get evicted, donates plasma weekly at 111 pounds. It's physically debilitating for her some of the time. She says, especially if my iron is down, I get really tired. And then we see in Paul Heckwalder's story a lot of old-fashioned American ingenuity. When the water gets shut off, he and his wife end up taking in 22 members of the extended family when the family pizza business fails. They take the gutter apart, they rig it up over the garbage can, and they use that water to flush the toilet. Here we see other evidence that things may be really changing at the bottom. These are plasma sales in America. The U.S. is the OPEC of plasma for the world. No other country allows us to sell plasma, donate plasma as often as they do in the United States. We provide 70% of the world's plasma, much of it going to Europe. And you can see that the rate since 2005 has grown from about 10,000 donations to, in 2014, over 30,000 donations. So I want to end by talking a little bit about the Mississippi Delta, a place in which work has all but disappeared. Welfare has all but disappeared as well. And even if you manage to get on TANF, the payment rate is so low that you and your children will actually remain in $2 a day poverty. There we followed several families, including Alva Mae Hicks and her children. Her 15-year-old daughter, Tabitha, became very close to us during the course of the study. After we got to know her a bit, she shared this harrowing story about what it was like to be so hungry as a child when your mother has to sell the food stamps to pay the utility bills in a climate that just in the last 6 months had ranged from 9 degrees to 109 degrees. And when we were sitting there talking about it, she related the story of turning 15 and getting a message on her on Facebook in her inbox from her gym teacher. And this message read, so everybody in town kind of knows about these hungry kids, right? The message reads, I've been watching you since you were young, waiting for you to mature. And then he invites her over to his house after school on promise of food and proceeds to molest her. And this initiates a sexual liaison that lasts for about 5 months until she finally tells another teacher, and he helps her not only get out of the situation, but manages to find a spot for her in a boarding school in Memphis. When we asked Tabitha what it was like to spend so much of her childhood being that hungry, she told us the following: "Sometimes it feels like you want to be dead, because it's peaceful being dead." So I want to end with sort of the central insight that really frames the end of the book. When we asked people what it would really mean to them to make it, they had endearingly modest goals. Many said, oh, if they can just make $12, $13 an hour, full-time, full year, that would be making it. In fact, that almost exceeded their dreams. Travis actually wanted $14 an hour. He was an outlier. Very modest ambitions, but even those ambitions seemed outside of the family's purview at present. But what none of them said is that they wanted more handouts. Now, we argue in $2 a day that we do need a functioning safety net because work doesn't always work. And that safety net needs to be a springboard for employment. But what every family in our study said is that they wanted more work. They wanted stable work. And they wanted enough work to be able to afford a place of their own so they can raise their children in safety and with stability. But even more than that, they wanted to belong. Every society draws a circle around those who are on the inside and those who are on the outside. Too many of our social welfare programs are stigmatizing, demeaning. They essentially force people to trade their citizenship cards, and to use the imagery of T.H. Marshall, they require claimants to cross the road that separates the destitute from the ordinary citizenry. So what our families say to us over and over again is that they want to work, they want to participate, they want to belong, they want to contribute. Now, in the same year that I wrote $2 a day, I wrote another book. Some of you may know that right about the time we passed welfare reform, a couple of years earlier, we instituted very generous tax credits for the full-time, full-year working poor. They don't work very well for part-time workers, but if you can manage to land a full-time, full-year job, you're going to get enough back from the government at tax time to ensure that you are just above the poverty threshold, something that had never been true before. And so, just before studying these extremely poor people, I was sort of studying the winners of welfare reform, right? The winners of these changes in the 1990s who were getting $5,000 or $6,000 back from the government at tax time because they had managed to claim full-time, full-year work. And we met many of them at the H&R Block office, where about 70% of tax credit claimants come to file their taxes, either H&R Block or one of its competitors. So while I was there, basically talking with EITC claimants and recruiting them into our study, we followed them over six months' time to look how they spent the money. I began to notice the most amazing things. So I'd started my career studying welfare. I was doing this study in Boston. In East Boston, there's this Dickensian building that used to be where the welfare office was. It's covered with soot. It dominates a half a city block. There are these big dirty brass letters over the door that say overseers of the public welfare. Everybody who saw you going through that door knew what you were doing there. Imagine the contrast between that system and approaching your friendly H&R Block a mile and a half away, big signs in the window, money in minutes, you've got people. And what people would say coming out of the H&R Block office, now remember, they were essentially getting a check that was a transfer from the government. But they had been treated like citizens, right? Like taxpayers. In fact, going to the H&R Block office was almost a coronation of citizenship. And they would say things like, I'm a real American, and I'm proud to be a taxpayer. And that's when I sort of maybe had a third epiphany, that it was possible to transform the way we serve our poorest and most vulnerable ways, in ways, families in ways that are citizen enhancing rather than citizen diminishing. And it is my belief, and I intend to test this in my participation with the Gates Foundation U.S. Partnership for Mobility Out of Poverty, that if we transformed our social safety net to lend dignity rather than shame, we might see positive externalities not only for individuals, but for communities as people became more civically engaged, and for our democracy as a whole. So stay tuned and begin to try it in your own workplaces. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Let's give Kathy another round of applause. I think our talks dovetail very nicely as we talk about matters of children and families in poverty. I am, as was stated earlier, I'm Valerie Mahomes from the National Institutes of Health in our Child Health Institute at the NIH. And before I get started, I just want to make my official disclaimer that none of what I say should be construed to be the official position or policy of the NIH, the Department of Health and Human Services, or the United States government. So I am here to talk about the science of children and families and what I've learned over the years in doing my work in this capacity at NIH, and also in other capacities that I've brought to my work in NIH. So today, what I essentially want to do is to introduce hope as an important construct, an important function in individual well-being. Just like Kathy described, I too had somewhat of an epiphany as we were studying children and families in poverty. We had an initiative maybe a decade or so ago called the Science and Ecology of Early Development. And in that initiative, we were looking at the effects of poverty and welfare and all the things that went along with it on children's development. And we ended that initiative talking about what the deleterious effects of poverty were, and we wrote a volume on that topic. And it occurred to me that there were families that we didn't talk so much about who, despite all statistical accounts, seemed to fare well, seemed to be successful as they defined it, despite adversity, despite the complexity of their lives living in poverty, despite some of the kinds of things that Kathy shared and that they talked about. And time again, as I dug a little deeper in those stories and in my own kind of volunteer work, my own community work, what I learned was that hope emerged as an important factor in child and family well-being and in individuals' ability to move forward. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking with you about hope as a theoretical construct, and I want to talk to you about it as a lever for personal change and growth and well-being. But before I do that, I want to share with you a few words from the President, not the President of the United States, but Kid President, as you see here. How many of you have seen this video before? Okay, very good. And we want to talk with you about, and he will share with you his own views about how to instill hope in individuals from the very first day. So what we're about to see is a clip of Kid President talking to his nephew on his very first day on Earth. And we're ready.
There's a lot that the kids need to know. A letter to a person on their first day here. Today, over 360,000 babies will be born, and you are one of them. Welcome, this is the world. It's a pretty cool place. There's lots to see, smell, there's corn dogs. I'm getting ahead of myself. There's just so much to do. Singing, and dancing, and laughing. Laughing's the best. It's especially great when you laugh and milk comes out of your nose. But only if you just have milk. Otherwise, it's just gross. Some days gross things will happen. Some days awesome things will happen. Some days you'll get ice cream. And some days you won't. Some days your kite will fly high. Some days it gets stuck in the tree. It's just how it is here. There's plenty of reasons to dance. You just gotta look for them. Don't worry though, you won't be doing this alone. You're gonna meet lots of people here. Some of them will be really nice, and some won't be. It's not that they can't be, it's just, maybe they're just having a bad day. Being a person is hard sometimes. You should give people high fives just for getting out of bed. Oh, high fives, I forgot to explain that. How do I explain this? It's kind of, high fives are like hitting someone who is your friend. That's really bad. Just treat everybody like it's their birthday, even if they don't deserve it. Because we all mess up sometimes. The biggest mess up, not forgiving each other's mess ups. Maybe you'll be a teacher. Maybe you'll be president. Maybe you'll cure every disease ever. You might even see the Grand Canyon, swim in the ocean. Oh, this is so much. It's a lot. Try this. Take a breath. Isn't that amazing? It's called breathing. You're going to do it a lot, but nobody knows exactly how much. So enjoy it. Pay attention. Take brain pictures. Because amazing things will happen every day. You're going to do so much. But it's not about what you do. It's about who you are. And you're awesome. You're made that way. You're made from love, to be loved, to spread love. Love is always louder, no matter what. Even if hate has a bullhorn, love is louder. So let your life be loud. Let's shout to the world. Things can be better. It's okay about all the mess ups. Corn dogs rule. Sorry, I'm just keep bringing that up. I don't think I told you this yet. We're really glad you're here. We don't say that enough to each other here because, well, life gets busy. You're gonna be important and you're gonna do a lot and you're gonna smell great, but don't get too busy. Remember to let everybody know you're glad they're here. You don't have to remember all this right now. You're gonna need a pep talk sometimes, and that's okay. For now, remember this. You're awake, you're awesome, live like it.
Isn't that wonderful? And in those few minutes of that video, what Kid President has done is really described in his own way what the families this morning were talking about in Family First. He was talking about some really important interventions. He talked about what happens when things go awry and how we get back on track. And so as I give my talk to you today, reflect while I'm talking about how do you overcome this generational effects of poverty, of child maltreatment, of trauma? What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the costs? So I started by saying that hope in my work and in my research emerged as a factor of well-being in children and families. It was one of the key levers that continued to emerge. So I asked the question, what is hope? And we talk about hope as a kind of wishful thinking in everyday language. We talk about it in terms of optimism, but there's a good body of research that talks about its value in moving us forward. And I asked the question, is there something inherent in us? Is there an inherent quality in human beings that makes us strive for our best selves, that makes us strive to achieve, to reach higher heights, and despite what the complexity is in our lives, that makes us strive to keep going every day? And Norman Cousins says this in his writings, that the capacity for hope is a most significant fact of life. It provides us with a sense of destination, the energy to get started. In everyday language, we talk about it again as what we wish for, our optimism, our thinking about what we desire and our ideal life. But also, the research points out that hope keeps you moving forward even when times are tough, and that it's not just a happy feeling, it's a human survival mechanism. The families this morning talked about coping, and that we couldn't survive without hope. There are economists who talk about families that have hope and families who don't pursue a vision of who they see themselves and who they want to be and what that difference is. We talk about hope as being a part of our cognitive abilities and affecting our behavior. So some of the research on hope show a relationship with health outcomes. Some researchers hypothesize that more hopeful individuals are better able to cope with serious life events, and that they may be less susceptible to illness. Some researchers talk about hope being a catalyst to recover from mental illness. And as we heard the families say this morning, talking about their fierce social networks, that hope can be fostered by friends and families and loved ones, and that it can start externally, but then it functions as an internalized quality to promote recovery. Jerome Groopman talks about hope in his work as a change of mindset, the power of hope to alter our neurochemistry, and that it can block pain by releasing the brain's endorphins and other hormones that mimic the effects of morphine, that happy feeling, that feeling of calm, that feeling of ease. And in some cases, hope can affect the fundamental physiological processes like respiration, circulation, and motor function. Research also suggests that hope is related to life satisfaction and well-being, and it's positively associated with personal and perceived competence and self-worth, a sense of self-worth, and it's negatively associated with symptoms of depression. It's not optimism, but it is associated with optimism, and researchers make a distinction between those two. Researchers like Snyder, who study hope in students and in academic contexts, talk about students who score high on measures of hope are generally more optimistic and also have life goals and perceive themselves as being capable of solving problems that arise. And I want to underscore that point. See themselves as being capable of solving problems that arise. Also correlated with hope is social competence, pleasure in getting to know others, these social skills and social qualities that are really important in navigating the complexities of their lives. Rick Snyder was a sociologist who studied hope and spent his career in trying to provide psychometric properties to his hope scales and to pinpointing how we can measure hope. And he said that hope is that which enables people to set clear and valued goals. And I want to understand that, not the goal, or underscore that rather, not the goals that we import, but valued goals to the individual, and for individuals to conceive of the means to achieve those goals and to have the drive to make those goals happen. And that hopeful thinkers imagine multiple workable pathways toward those goals, and that they persevere to get to that achieved goal. Hope theory, as Curnow was reflecting on Snyder's work and other work, Curnow suggested that hope theory recognizes the individual as the primary source of energy and focuses that energy on the planning and the engine that moves the individual to achieve those desired goals. Again, it's not just a reflection of optimal functioning, but it actually produces optimal functioning by broadening a person's mindset, so that novel and creative responses are more likely and builds resilience to prepare for the future. And we know a lot more about the current brain science that talks about creating neural networks so that we can continue to have stronger regulatory capacities, executive functions, and so forth. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Again, we talk about hope as a deeply felt neurochemical stance that our minds take toward current circumstances. It alters our outlook and our actions, as well as the life paths that unfold before us. Human behavior, according to Curnow and their reflection on Snyder and others' work, is that it's primarily driven by the pursuit of goals, the moving and the constant navigating and negotiating the system. It comes out of a synthesis of Snyder's pathway and agency thinking that I'll talk about in a moment, and that these are vital for success in meeting goals. It's a cognitive process rather than an emotion. And I think that's a distinctive difference between what we think about with hope and wishful thinking, and our research is beginning to underscore that a lot more. It involves motivation and the willpower to engage in continuous goal pursuit. And it sounds simple, but that's not an easy thing. Especially in the context of adversity, we know that stress and trauma affect child outcomes, and Kathy just talked about adverse childhood experiences. We know that children who are exposed early in life to family dysfunction, to child maltreatment, to abuse and neglect, that they have the likelihood as they age and as they grow into adulthood to have challenges in behavioral outcomes and in health outcomes. And the more adverse childhood experiences they have, the more likely it is that they will have negative outcomes or have difficulty achieving positive and pro-social outcomes in health and behavior as they age. Kristen Moore and her colleagues at Child Trends not only looked at adverse childhood experiences in young children, but in adolescents, and determined the same thing, that adolescents who had multiple adverse childhood experiences were also likely to have behavior challenges, not a surprise. And that adolescents had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, again, were likely to have difficulty with their behavioral and health outcomes. One of the things that I want to point out, again, underscoring that point, is that adolescents who had 3 or more indicators of adverse childhood experiences were more likely than their peers who had 1 or fewer adverse childhood experiences to do well in school and to do well as they emerged into adulthood. But the point that I really want to raise here is this one indicator of completing tasks that were started, that 49% of adolescents who completed this survey indicated that they had difficulty completing tasks that they started. And in thinking about that, it occurred to me that not only does adverse childhood experiences have an effect on behavioral and health outcomes, but to what extent do these ACEs have an effect on an individual's capacity for hope? If we think about hope as a goal-oriented, decision-making cognitive process, to what extent do these adverse childhood experiences have on a child's ability or an individual's ability to have hope and to have these drives toward achieving their goal? So how do we connect the dots between adverse childhood experiences and hope? Hope matters, which is my new mantra. Hope matters for children and family in poverty, because what hope does is change the narrative for these children and families. Youth who experience these adverse childhood experiences may believe that anything bad that happens to them is out of their control or simply what they deserve. And we heard the families this morning talking about that. But Snyder's theory talks about hope as engendering a sense of self-control, of personal control, of individual agency. Hope provides a safe environment and practice opportunities and provides exposure to models of opportunities to receive positive and constructive feedback and to contribute to a sense of personal agency and goals. Youth often lack a sense of personal and future orientation. And in my work, I think that that's one of the most deleterious outcomes of poverty, when you can't see what you can be, when you take away an individual's sense of future orientation, sense of a vision of who they can be and who they are in the world. So setting personal goals for the future and developing strategies to affect those goals can change that future orientation. So what we need are programs that provide those developmental experiences to help change those beliefs and to give children a sense and families a sense of who they can be and to change that narrative about what their future orientation might be. So overcoming adversity is really important. What we want to do is move toward an internal locus of control and help families to manage those adversities in such a way that they will have that sense of internal locus of control, that we want to ramp up the protective factors and that will allow them to have hope, as Snyder and other researchers define it, and move away the external barriers and the kind of external sense of defining who you are, and allow individuals to define for themselves what success is and what achievement is. So hope theory, according to Snyder, is three-pronged. It focuses on goal-directed behavior, as I mentioned earlier. It focuses on pathways thinking and agency thinking. And agency thinking is the kind of motivational force behind hope. It is what mobilizes individuals. It is that belief that you can instigate change and achieve that goal. And in many ways, it's a lot like self-efficacy. So, and hope also is rooted in brain development theory and is a lot like what we talk about in executive functions. So the mechanisms of hope really mirror that. We have decision making, all of those found in the prefrontal cortex, social and behavioral regulation that we're learning about that helps students pay attention and engage and do well in school, regulating attention, problem solving, being able to have those valued goals that we talked about earlier, working memory and processing, all of those are found in the prefrontal cortex, planning and initiating activities. So hope, as Snyder defines it, is rooted in executive functions in that prefrontal cortex. So starting with the first prong, goal setting, we want to help children and families see what they can be. This sounds very easy, but this is a difficult work for practitioners and advocates and service providers of working with children and families, helping people visualize what they can aspire to be. We talked about in earlier sessions today about the stigma that is often laid upon families in poverty and families who might be struggling and who have complexities in their lives. And oftentimes we engage with them as though they don't have dreams, they don't have aspirations, and that they can't visualize what they can be. I did some work with families earlier in my career and asked parents who were living in difficult circumstances and had lots of complexity in their lives to share with me what their dreams were for their children. And I just want to share some excerpts from some of those families. My dream is for my son to be assured, these are unedited, to be assured of himself, to be positive and not limitless, caused from fear. I want him to look at problems head on and deal with it in a right manner without taking drastic measures. I see a potential in him. He liked to draw, but I see a barrier in his life when it comes to solving a problem which he's not familiar with, and make him to be easily distracted because of not staying focused on a problem when it comes to schoolwork. Another family member who I will call Kiana says, my dream for my child is to go to school and finish, to go to college and finish, to love himself and others, to set goals, to respect himself and others. And so these are just a few examples and excerpts that family members shared with us. They do have dreams. They do have a vision of what they want and see for their children. And our job as advocates, practitioners working with these families is to help them to tap into that vision and that passion, to help them devise goals that are meaningful to them, to help them to see what they can be, and then to help them break down those goals in ways that are manageable and feasible. And to look at their social networks and to think about achieving those goals in the context of that social network, not in isolation. Oftentimes these families think that they don't have anywhere to go, that there's no one to help them, and they work in isolation. So having them think of in terms of we rather than making the goals just on their own power. One thing I want to underscore is encouraging approach rather than avoidance goals. Oftentimes, we have individuals make these goals to avoid getting into trouble, to avoid negative behavior, to avoid, let's say, dropping out of school. But what we want to do is to help them change that narrative and to set approach goals, to move toward a positive and desired outcome. Can you see what the difference is in the language and the narrative when you're using more positive language, when you're talking about moving towards something rather than moving away from something? Think about the power and the empowerment that's engendered when you're helping people to set approach goals. Pathways thinking. Help people see what they can be, showing them the way, helping families to break down those goals and charting out the multiple steps in achieving those goals. Having a plan B and a plan C and a plan D if necessary. Oftentimes, some of the families that we've studied, they have a single pathway. They want to get a job and they want to go to school. But what happens if that doesn't work? How do you help families to think about a plan B, another strategy, to have multiple routes? I often talk about my own career. My career is like following the yellow brick road. I didn't get here from a straight path from A to B. I took multiple pathways to do what I'm doing today. And there were people who encouraged me to help me keep going, and that's what we want to do for families, to help them keep going and to learn not to attribute a blockage as some kind of an innate problem in them, as something that's negative inside of them, but to think about that as a way to negotiate the system, to develop new skills, to navigate these challenges and the complexities of their lives. And also remember to remind them that they can ask for help. We heard the families talking about that this morning, but knowing who to get to and where to go to seek services and to seek help is really, really important. And that's an important skill to have. Agency thinking, again, the whole notion of self-efficacy, encouraging people to believe in themselves and knowing that you believe in them as well. Helping them to move from this external locus of control to an internal locus of control, to having those personal standards that are energizing, that are beyond whatever you and I could impose on someone. I often say to my colleagues that I work for myself. Yes, I get a paycheck from the federal government, but I work for myself, and my standards are higher than anybody else's standards for me. And families and individuals have those standards, and we want them to build that internal locus of control so that they continue to work toward those goals. We want to encourage them to have positive self-talk. Sometimes the sub-vocalizations, if you listen very carefully to some families, the sub-vocalizations often are negative. Oh, I made this dumb mistake. I knew I couldn't do this. People told me that I couldn't do this. And you want to move them away from that negative self-talk to more positive self-talk. And that is empowering in and of itself. We talk about mentoring an awful lot, but it's important to have mentors who have been through the same kinds of challenges that these families are going through, so that you're not just presenting to these families that you're working with the poster child for success and resilience and overcoming, but for people who have taken 3 steps forward and 4 steps backwards, for people who are still struggling, but who have defined success for themselves and have pathways to achieve that success and to overcome that adversity. Positive emotions is very powerful, and researchers are talking about the fact that positive emotions can undo this negative emotional arousal. And sometimes we talked earlier about these neural networks, and sometimes if you start out with having these early adversities, what you're doing is building these pathways that activate negative emotional arousal. But learning to have positive emotions can create new neural networks to circumvent that negative arousal, broadens attention and thinking, emotional and psychological resilience, promoting physical health, psychological well-being. So let's talk about resilience for a moment. I'd like to talk about resilience as a process. We talk about overcoming. In this society, we love to talk about people who have pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, right? We love the rags to riches success stories. We love to talk about how people overcame and made it, but it is a process. And I think it's important to let people know that whom you're working with, that it is a process of adapting in the face of adversity, overcoming tragedy or significant sources of stress in their lives, and that bouncing back from adversity is a difficult experience often, and sometimes will come with emotional distress, making them aware that it's no panacea, but that life is a process of taking steps forward and taking steps backwards and renegotiating and learning from that and finding those other multiple pathways. Resilience is not a trait that people have or don't have. We often say that these families are resilient, these people are resilient. It's not a trait that people have, but it involves behavior, it involves thinking, it involves that positive emotional thinking, that agency thinking, the thoughts and actions that can be learned. And it can be developed in anyone. In fact, Ann Maston in her research talks about it as that ordinary magic of everyday life of individuals, and that resilience arises from that normative function of human adaptation, and that the greatest threat to human development are those that compromise our protective systems, those systems that allow us to rise above, that allow us to engage, that allow us to keep going. So what we want to do is continue to build protective factors, continue to allow families to understand what those protective factors are and to move toward that. A cautionary note. Some of the research that we're funding looks at the cost of resilience. And Dr. Brody and his colleagues talk about, ask the question, is resilience skin deep? Do we only see the outside semblance of resilience, that people have overcome, they're going to work every day, they're not engaging in risky behaviors, they're exhibiting pro-social behavior? But at what cost? And what he talks about is this kind of John Henry effect of the families that he's studied in rural America. That this John Henry effect, that I can do it, that I've overcome, and that there's just this one step away from getting back to the circumstances that they have come out of, and the stress of that knowledge that I'm living from paycheck to paycheck, and I could potentially get back to the circumstances that I was in, or that knowledge that I am the only one in my family who has overcome in this way, and I have to represent my family. People are counting on me. People are looking at me as an example and as a mentor. That stress of constantly achieving and striving, Brody and his colleagues say, may have some negative outcomes in terms of physical health, and in terms of hypertension, obesity, cardiovascular health, and that what we need to do is pay attention to those unknown costs of resilience. So for those of us who are working with children and families and who are studying resilience and who are studying hope and who are studying optimism, that we need to think about providing continuous emotional support and what that means and what that looks like with families, to strengthen those protective factors and the processes that go along with that. to provide an ongoing investment in evidence-based interventions. All too often, when we check that box that families have made it, that they're no longer engaging in substance use and abuse, or that they are no longer engaging with the system, or that they have housing, or that they're no longer engaging in violent or criminal activity or behavior, we check that box and we move our resources on to other things. But what Brody and his colleagues are saying, and what some of our research is suggesting, is that we need to provide an investment in ongoing support over the course of life, because there might be various triggers across the lifespan that might engage that individual in ways that are not productive, and that might cause the individuals to take a few steps backwards instead of continuing to move forward. And we need to provide those protective resources and those evidence-based interventions over time. We need culturally and developmentally appropriate and sustained mentoring. Culturally and developmentally appropriate, sustained mentoring. For young people especially, we don't want to helicopter in and out of their lives, but we want to have mentors that are with these young people and that are committed to their growth and development, so that they are not left to their own devices when they get to aspects of their lives where they could potentially have trouble, or where they could potentially have some slippage. So these are the important aspects that Brody and his colleagues and other researchers are starting to underscore. So to summarize, this is the very exciting work of hope, but it's also the very challenging work of hope. It's easy to talk about it in optimistic terms, as I've just described, but the work of guiding people through navigating the complexities of their lives takes commitment. And it takes dedication, and it takes resources. And what we want to do is to help families learn to select optimal and realistic goals so that we can help them devise those multiple pathways and take those various steps toward achieving their goals. An ideal level of challenge, approach rather than avoidance goals. Breaking down those goals into steps. Sometimes I hear families say in the research that we support that they get overwhelmed by all of the interventions that we bring to them. And sometimes they wind up not doing any of it, or not coming back to their appointments because they get overwhelmed by all the different kinds of things that we're offering for them. So we want to provide opportunities for families to experience these types of interventions that are feasible and that are valued goals for them. We want to create the visual pathways and scenarios to achieving those goals. The mindfulness research is something that I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about, and that I'd like to call your attention to. Increasing that positive self-talk, the words that we use matters. How you talk to individuals that you're working with matters, and how they talk about themselves, how they talk about their children. It matters. It matters. And we want them to understand that overcoming and hope and achievement is a continuous process, and that we have to keep in mind that cost of resilience, and to continue to scaffold and provide the resources and the mentoring and the fierce social networks to these individuals throughout life. And we can do this. We can do this. The power of hope is in our hands. This is a young man who participated in a youth development initiative that I started some years ago. And we brought these young people into the labs. These were kids that were deemed by their school officials to be at risk for poor outcomes. We brought them into our labs, and we showed them a mouse brain, and you can see there a slice of a human brain. We put their little robes and their capes on them. We put gloves on them. And we taught them some basics about how the brain functions and all the capacity that they have inside of them already. And we told them that they have it, that they can do it, that there's nothing that they can encounter that they cannot overcome with help and support, and with the knowledge that they have the capacity to change, to grow, to develop, to have hope, and to overcome. So I'll stop there, and just ask you to turn to the person sitting next to you and say that the power of hope is in our hands. Thank you. And now we'll take questions.
I love your book. So glad you're here. And I work with young people who are in the foster care system and trying to connect them to employment. And so I was really struck by your book, $2 a Day, talking about the struggles in actually finding employment and how difficult it is for people to actually get a job. I think about the woman who was trying to get a job and she had to fill out on her iPhone the questions about what you think about the workplace. And so I'm wondering, how do we take what you talk about, the reality of the workplace, and balance it with hope? Because we try and do the work that we can to send our young people who've had many different struggles out into this workplace where they encounter some of these things that are really hard to manage, and how do we kind of buffer them? So I'm just asking you, how do we handle the reality of the workplace versus the hope that we want to instill in our young people going forward?
So that's a great question. You're talking about Susan Brown. She was a mother we met in the Roseland section of Chicago who had a little girl, adorable little girl, and was on bed rest, having lost a prior pregnancy, and she was finally back to work, and was, as we followed her, we watched her fill out 50 job applications on her tiny little iPhone screen without success. One thing she would say to us is that she would cry uncontrollably for hours every time she actually got a call back, and then actually got an interview, and then was never called for a job. And I was, after sort of hanging out with Susan Brown for several years, I was reading Matthew Lieberman's book, Social, and if you know anything about that line of research, it talks about how social rejection affects us physiologically in the same way as if we'd been punched in the gut. So imagine these repeated sources of rejection in the labor market. And this is, and Susan was experiencing this in 2012 and 2013, well beyond the recession. Even though we have a relatively tight labor market, at the bottom, you can search over and over again. Man, in Baltimore, it is just punishingly hard to get a job. And even in relatively tight labor markets, finding full-time work is extraordinarily difficult. The quality of the jobs, too, are a huge problem. At a local grocery store near me, if you're hired, you can get 15 hours a week to start, but if you take a second job, they cut you back to 5 because they're punishing you for having to schedule around you. And adults are actually trying to raise children on these jobs. So the experience of rejection continues when you get into the labor market. Compounded with that are people's experiences when they encounter democracy in various ways, the police, the lack of social services, youth-focused programming, recreation centers in the community, mostly closed down, the disrespectful treatment when they approach everything from the DMV to the food stamp office and so on. So social rejection is so powerful and so ubiquitous, and it is registering physiologically with many of our young people. So I think what we need to do is we need to really recognize and honor this gauntlet of work, and certainly advocate, for expanded work opportunity. But to the extent that we can recognize and support young people when their hope is being annihilated by a punishing labor market, it's almost like we have to be, super hope evangelists in order to compensate for some of that negative, that onslaught of negative feedback.
I love that, super hope evangelist. That will be my next my next line of inquiry. One of the things that I want to say is that, again, these are the complexities of the lives of the families that we work with, and you know, talking about hope in scientific terms, in the way that Snyder lays it out, would suggest that you make sure that as you're working with these people who are getting this social rejection, that you teach them positive self-talk, teach them mindfulness, teach them that that experience, they don't own that, not to let them wear that label. I don't even like that phrase, I am unemployed, that right now people haven't had the good sense to hire me. But you know, have them think about using positive self-talk in such a way that it doesn't have that deleterious effect, because Kathy's absolutely right. Every interaction that we have with young people has an impact on their well-being. And what we want to do is not to paint this rosy picture that you're going to get everything that you want just because you set out to do it, but to have them know from the outset that it's going to be a challenge, and this is the landscape that you're working with, but do not own it. You know, try not to let that get into your psyche. And it's easy to say, but it's a challenge to do. You have to be willing to stay the course with these individuals that you're working with, and have to be willing to let them have voice and share the voice, share the experiences that they have, and teach them other kinds of skills like mindfulness that will help them to put those experiences in proper perspective.
I've got a question here from live stream. What do you think can be done about the GAP individuals that don't qualify for welfare but don't make enough money to live, especially when it comes to childcare? So this is a really good point. We have this thing called a poverty line in America. We made it up on the fly in the 60s. You know, it puts a family of 3 with no other income in the mid-20s, and we say that if you make over that, you're not poor. But if you ask any group of undergraduates around the country to derive a poverty line from a minimal level expenditures that would support such a family, undergraduate after undergraduate will come up with a figure of at least $35,000. So there is this, not only are people who are eligible for cash welfare not getting it, most people who are eligible for welfare are not getting it, because the states now take 3/4 of the money they get from the federal government for welfare and they spend it on other things. Little known fact, very important. Even those who are deemed to be making too much to be eligible for welfare aren't making it. So we really have to focus on the quality of the work and the struggles of getting by. Now, at tax time, we find that those folks do make it into the black and do manage to save and to spend on mobility purposes. And they're very child-focused in those expenditures at tax time. But they're in the red the rest of the month. So even if somebody is working full-time, full year, at close to the minimum wage, they're probably living in the black every month. And you can imagine until February comes and they get that golden ticket, that earned income tax credit. So, you know, and this is true if they have a Medicaid card. This is true if they have food stamps. We sometimes delude ourselves into thinking that people can live on $25,000 a year. And in fact, there are almost no places in America where you could even pay your rent at the fair market rent with a low-wage job. So, very good point.
We have another question that says, in cases of extreme poverty, adversity may come so fast and furious that you keep getting knocked down before you can get back up. Do we have research or ideas about how to deal with constant negative reinforcement? Should we be concerned that social policy will emphasize hope as a substitute for meeting basic human needs? This is such an important question, and I have to say, I did some writing on hope, and as I was conceptualizing that, I was a little concerned that it might be, I'm going to use the word frivolous, to write about that when people are really struggling. And would policymakers say, well, gee, you know, you can overcome, and the research says that if you have hope, that you don't need nothing else. I was convinced by the family members that I worked with that this was an important construct and that it's more than just, as I said, this pie in the sky, but that it is inherent in the human quality. And I think we're going to have more research that will support that quality. And maybe we won't call it hope as more researchers start to look at that and to do more biopsychosocial research. Maybe it'll be called something else. But there is something inherent in us that keeps us moving despite that, those kinds of getting knocked down constantly. And again, I would just point out that mentorship and coaches and partnerships and having those fierce networks are really, really important. A case study that I'll reference was about an individual who had that similar kind of experience. Every step that this individual took was a step in the wrong direction, and every time he thought he made an advance, it appeared that the system was against him, and it was difficult for him to get ahead. He abused substances, and that was also another complicating factor. But the one thing that kept him moving and that kept him motivated, despite the fact that it seemed like everything was against him, was that his daughter was in the foster care system, and she was being bounced around from family to family to family. And he wanted so much to get his daughter out of that system that was a motivating factor for him. He was able to get himself connected up with an agency that provided housing, temporary housing, and also provided skills to teach him how to pay bills, pay them on time. This individual thought that if he paid his electric bill once, that was it. You know, I paid my bill. I have to keep coming back and paying it again. So teaching them about budgeting, things that we take for granted, and taught him how to maintain a household. And once he was able to become stable, he was able to re-engage with his child and his family, and began to have one little success. And one little success created another success and another success. So I guess to answer the person's question, we should be locked in a conspiracy as child advocates. I often say I'm unapologetically an advocate for children, and we ought to be locked in a conspiracy to promote the optimal growth and development of children at all costs, and that we need to urge policymakers that we have to do both. We have to support basic human needs, and that we have to give people opportunities to grow and develop.
Dr. Eden, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about where those TANF dollars are going, if they're not going to TANF, if there's some general statements you could make about that? Are they helping the people who would otherwise be receiving TANF or not?
Mostly no. The reason there's so much flexibility in TANF now versus in the old AFDC system, these are the two names for welfare, both before and after welfare reform, is that we moved welfare from an entitlement in 1996 to a block grant. And we said to states, we want you to innovate, right? We often hear this, freedom is innovation. So we're going to give you very loose parameters with regard to how to spend the money. And we're going to see what you come up with. Now, sounds good, right? But what happened is that states began over time to really engage in a race to the bottom. Some states kind of do the right thing, I guess you would say, in investing quite a lot in childcare, but that only helps you if you're working. I will say that two of those states are Illinois and Ohio, so I just want to call those states out. In those cases, I think, at least you're helping the working poor, and of course that's very important given the last question that came from the live stream. But more often, the money is used to either plug state budget holes or to fund goodies that governors want to give away to citizens. The most common example of filling a state budget hole is to spend the money, ironically, on your child welfare system. Now, that money would have to come out of the state coffers, right? Otherwise, but many state governors, when they get in a bind, maybe they've cut taxes too much, or they face a fiscal shortfall, they'll take the money from TANF and they'll use it to fund their child welfare system. Again, not a bad thing to do, but not at the cost of the very children who are in danger of falling into the care of the child welfare system, so that it's possible that you're actually feeding your child welfare system by diverting the money to it. And one of the states that is most notorious for doing this is the state of Texas, but many other states do this. It's one of the most common uses of TANF. Other states do very creative things with the money, goodies, giveaways, creative things governors want to do. Michigan, for example, funds some of its state's college scholarship program under the logic that it will help prevent teen pregnancy. So Chrissy Clark on Marketplace and the Uncertain Hour, a podcast series, does this great sort of visit to a very affluent, swanky private liberal arts college in Michigan, and she identifies several of the students who have gotten these scholarships, and she says, hey, did you know you're on welfare? And they're like, I'm not on welfare. And then she says, well, do you think it's justified? Oh, absolutely. Even the middle class. You know, one young woman, I think, has parents who are making $150,000 a year. So that is going on in some cases. In other cases, the funds have been used to fund marriage promotion programs like Building Strong Families and strengthening healthy families, although I will say that that was in the legislation, so that it's actually an approved use of the money, something that was intended by the law. Louisiana uses some of the money to fund crisis pregnancy centers, which are kind of an alternative to seeking abortion services in the state. So all of these uses could be justified as good ways for governments to spend the money. But what you have to ask yourself is, in a state like Texas, where I believe the TANF to poverty ratio is about 9%, where virtually no poor child, even children with zero income, are showing up at the door of the cash welfare system, whether that's how we want states to be able to spend the money. The temptation is huge, because what we did when we block granted TANF, right, is we created a slush fund for states with almost no regulation. And while states could have innovated, and I think the architects of welfare reform meant well, I know many of them, and I think they meant well, and most of them are horrified by what's happened with TANF. We probably should really take a lesson from what has happened with TANF and insist on experimentation and accountability in any change we make to our basic safety net programs.
Thank you, doctors. Very thought-provoking talk today. I just have and given that my mind is spinning with all kinds of questions, thinking about neglect being the largest proportion of children among those maltreated in our country, either due to a lack of supervision or a failure to provide, which in my mind basically equals poverty. So how are we to even conceptualize or think about interventions or fostering hope in a manner that's effective to prevent neglect, given the systemic barriers that Dr. Eden has already clearly highlighted? I mean, my mind's swimming, and I don't know what that looks like, because I'm thinking about how to foster hope in the children. Then I'm thinking, well, no, that needs to be role modeled by their parents, but their parents don't have tangible experiences to implement a hope action plan.
I want to ask Valerie to answer this question, but I just want to say one sentence, and that is, when I studied the welfare system prior to the changes, and I'm not advocating that we go back to that system, so don't get me wrong, I think we can find a better way. Mothers were often able to use that floor that AFDC provided to sort of shield their children from the ugly realities of what they were going through. But in the research on $2 a day, what I see is that children are not shielded. And they're exposed to the extremities of the struggles of their parents in very real ways, and they're drawn in and even become party to those extreme survival strategies that their parents have to engage in.
Yeah, and it's a challenging question. I don't know that there are any right answers. This morning, we heard families say that talk to us and devise your intervention strategies on who we are and where we are right now. So not every family who we might deem or a set of parents that we might deem as neglectful might be doing that because of perhaps intergenerational kinds of issues. They might need money.
Yeah.
And we might be deeming it neglectful because they don't have XYZ resources. And money does make a difference. I think that that's an important point to raise. But there are parenting interventions that, like home visiting and other kinds of interventions that work with parents where they are, identifies what their needs are, that will help them to just take it one step at a time. And I think oftentimes in our rush to kind of move people, from point A to point B, that we don't often have the patience for the long haul and for the step-by-step process that it takes. Some of the research that I was referencing, we've funded some intergenerational studies where we're on the third generation, and we're looking at now those cycles finally starting to change. So I think for those of us that support families, that we have to recognize that that it is a difficult challenge, that every family is different, that their circumstances for having resources or not, for being perceived to be neglectful or not, are different family by family. Some of it's cultural. Sometimes we call something neglect that's a cultural practice. So we have to be careful at how we consign these families and how we label these families. That's one of the reasons that I love some of these kinds of evidence-based programs that get into the homes, that meet people where they are, and that engage families in their own process of overcoming. And that, to me, is what hope is. Not some, ephemeral idea, but something that is based on real evidence, and that is a strategy that takes into account the multiple pathways that people might take to achieve their goals.
So I have a feeling this conversation could go on for a while, and I wish it could, but we've reached the end of our time frame. So I encourage you to acknowledge the wonderful contributions that Dr. Holmes and Dr. Eden have made to our understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder, this is a special time where you can go see the exhibits and the posters and all, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you for being here.